afternoon to talk about economics and religion, why economists should care about religion in Africa. And we were sort of chit-chatting before we get here and already had a lot of interesting exchanges on why indeed it is important. Just a little bit of background on Dr. Amma, I call you Dr. Amma from now on, who is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Louvain, studying how risk and uncertainty shape economic decision-making, and with a particular interest in understanding how contemporary religious institutions evolve to provide substitutes to insurance and other services that might otherwise be provided by either formal markets or the state, I think. Amma, it's really a pleasure to have you. We agreed that you'll be speaking for about 30 to 40 minutes. Then we open up for discussion, both, of course, with people here in the room, but especially also with people online. So without further ado, Dr. Amma, please go ahead.
Great, thanks very much for having me. I'll just minimize this. And also very happy to be called Amma without the doctor as well. So it's a big pleasure to be here this afternoon. And I titled my talk, Why Should Economists Care About Religion in Africa? But what I hope it would do is my mission to get more of my colleagues to care about the topic that I care about. I would like to share some of those arguments with this interdisciplinary group and hopefully start a conversation. So I see the first 30 minutes of this talk as laying the groundwork for the conversation that I hope comes afterwards. So just to give a bit of background about where the talk I'm going to give comes from. A year ago, I was going to give a lecture as part of the Policy and Equality Group, which is a group of development economists from mainly German universities, but quite international. It was going to be the lecture at the big annual meeting, but then that was canceled due to COVID. And so they said, would you write us a policy brief about anything you care about instead? And I thought this is a wonderful opportunity to talk a bit more about the economics of religion. And so I titled that 4 Reasons Why Analysis of Economic Policy and Religion Should Go Hand in Hand. And sort of the argument that I set up in this policy brief and the argument that I'm going to develop a little bit as I talk this afternoon is that the main reason we should care is because economics is important to, is because religion is important to the lives of people across Africa. And that it's impossible to understand people's economic lives, motivations, and choice environments without also building a deeper understanding of how religious beliefs and practices might play into those. And so that's what I'm going to focus on a bit today. So I'll talk mainly about 3 reasons to care. I'll tell you a bit why I dropped the 4th one. It's mostly the interest of time this afternoon. But I start from the first claim that, I think about what economists do quite well. Economists study how people allocate scarce resources. And I take a step back and say, I think if you ask 15 economists what economists do, you'll get 15 answers. As it happens, you have invited this particular one. So this is where I start from thinking about that. And in particular, I think about the tools that are relevant to some of my studies in religion. So 1 is by formally modeling how individuals make choices, and 2 is by establishing statistical regularities in data. So I started with this to just give you a framework of what I'm going to share. I'm going to share some of the recent models that have come up to try to think about, well, if we take religious beliefs or religious practices seriously in an economic model, what are some of the implications? So those are some of the models I'm going to describe. And the second part is to describe some of the broad statistical regularities that might come up when we start thinking about how and why is religion important in the African context. So if we think about economics as in part a study of how people allocate scarce resources, this includes things like time, attention, money, and My strong argument is that across the African continent, things like time, attention, money are allocated relatively often to religious beliefs and practices. So, as I said earlier, what I'm going to try to do is to make this claim that if we want to understand the economic lives of people living in Africa, we need to consider the role of religion. Firstly, simply because religion is important. Secondly, because if we're thinking about the choice environment, so how people make decisions about allocations, it's important to think about the special role religious beliefs might play in changing the choice environment that people have. And so I'll talk a bit more about how we might think about formalizing this idea of the choice environment in certain contexts. The third reason I'll talk about is that religious and secular economic institutions may be substitutes. So this is to think about the fact that many institutions that we think about, things like insurance, things like savings, things like credit, those could all be provided by a bank, by a government institution, but they could equally well be, and perhaps even more effectively, be provided by an institution that organizes itself around religion. And so the more that we see that there are these substitutes, it helps us understand take-up and the way people engage in some of the secular institutions that we might care about. So the fourth reason that I talked about in my policy brief was also thinking about how the political economy of the region might be changed by religious beliefs and changing religious demographies. So I've left that out for two reasons. One, because I want to spend a bit more time on the first three, and two, because I think there's relatively less empirical evidence on that from the African context. And most of what I want to focus on today is doing these two things that I think economists do well, or that I enjoy as an economist. So first, sharing some of the recent theoretical predictions, and then second, sharing some of the empirical results that inform these models. And then I'll end with some examples from my own work. So the main overview will be hopefully to give you an overview of what some people are thinking of in the very, very, very small field of the economics of religion. And then hopefully at the end, I could give you some more detail on some things I've worked on directly. But that's less exciting, I think, than giving an overview so that we can have a nice discussion. I'll pause here to say I am very happy to be interrupted both in person and online. Timed all this to be interrupted, so please ask me questions as we go along, as well as saving them for the discussion. And I will take a proper pause now just to make sure everyone online can hear and is okay. Or if there are any questions so far. Okay. So moving on, just to say a couple of things that I do not do, the caveats before I go into some of the work I want to share. I'm talking very broadly about religion, and I'm sort of taking the idea that religion is something that is differently defined, but is meaningful in certain contexts to people. So when I show you survey evidence where people are asked the question, is religion important to you? I'm taking it as given that however people who are responding to that question understand religion, that is the variable I'm going to use. So I think this is a limitation, but it's something I just want to be clear that not defining what religion is, although some of the models I'll talk about thinking about how the choice environment has changed do start to get to the idea of, well, what is specific about religion as opposed to other ways of organizing society that might matter. But I'll only do that on a sort of ad hoc basis. Second thing I'm not going to do very much is go into very much detail on the differences between different religions in Africa. So my goal in the next, now about 25 minutes, is to try to give a broad overview. Not going to get into as much specifics as I'd like to, but in a couple of places where I say more work is needed and more questions are raised, they are particularly on thinking about the fact that we have these predictions about religion, but it clearly matters if we are talking about Pentecostal Christianity versus traditional beliefs versus Islam. And so I'll try to be very specific on where the evidence comes from, but I think there's a lot more to be done in terms of thinking about how different experiences and different traditions might interact. And then finally, what I am not going to do as I speak, but I hope we do when we have the discussion, is as I discuss the heavy debt owed to other disciplines studying religious beliefs and practices in Africa. So as I'd had a discussion with Professor Decker before, I have read a lot from people from this institute and many other non-economists as I'm starting to understand what economics can do. Most of the papers I cite here are economics papers because what I want to do is open up a discussion about economics. So I just want to give that caveat up front and leave lots of room for the discussion afterwards. Okay, so let's go into the reasons. So the first reason I say we should care is simply because religion is important to people in the region. And I'll show you a couple of charts, a couple of aggregate statistics to sort of justify this leading statement. So starting off with this figure I often put up from the World Value Survey. So this is a figure looking at the proportion of people in the World Value Survey who say religion is very or somewhat important to them. So what we have on the x-axis are just countries in the World Value Survey. I've chosen to highlight countries in sub-Saharan Africa and countries in Europe. So sub-Saharan Africa in red, Europe in blue. And what we have on the y-axis is the proportion of respondents who say religion is very important or somewhat important to me. A lot of the reason I set up the chart in this way with highlighting Africa versus Europe is one of my communication devices to my colleagues, which is to say, simply because religion is not important to you, my Belgian colleagues, it does not mean that religion is not important to many other people across the world. And so two big takeaways from this chart. One is that in many parts of the world, close to 100% of the sample say religion is very important to them. Primarily, African countries have very high numbers, but the second thing I want to highlight here is just the distribution. So important takeaway from this for me and in everything that I talk about when I'm showing aggregate statistics is that I talk about Africa, I talk about religion being important, but of course there's a lot of heterogeneity. So we keep that in mind. So that's in terms of what people say when they're asked, is this important to you or not? Here's a second chart also using World Value Survey data. What this is looking at is rather looking at the number of people who say they are actively involved in a religious institution. The axes are the same with countries on the x-axis and proportions on the y-axis. And again, what we see is that the number of people who say they're actively involved, where actively involved is defined as spending a significant amount of time beyond beyond the occasional big services. That's how that question is defined. It's about 70% in a country like Kenya, about 50% in a country like Ethiopia. So again, African countries tend to be the most actively involved, although of course there is some variation. One thing I like about comparing this chart about active involvement, where Zimbabwe is one of the lowest, to the previous chart about is religion important to me, where Zimbabwe, again, close to 100% of people say religion is important. So one of the ways that you can explain the difference is simply the fact of the types of religious organizations that people participate in. So religion could be important to people without necessarily being part of an institution. And that's just something I wanted to highlight that I find interesting already coming out of this. Okay, the third piece of aggregate data that I want to share with you to sort of justify the statement that religion is important is simply thinking about, well, in which parts of the world do we see a lot of religious dynamism and switching? And so one way that I've been looking at that is just simply looking at which different denominations are experiencing growth in numbers or changes in numbers. And so it's interesting to look, for example, at how many people switch between religions in sub-Saharan Africa. That is higher relative to other parts of the world. So there's dynamism in the market for religions, if we can say that. And what I'm showing here is one example of that. What I've done here is use the World Christian Database, which regularly collects numbers of people who have affiliated with different denominations within different religions. And so a denomination would be sort of a subgroup of Protestant Christianity. That's how you should think about what each of these rows are. So the World Christian Database has numbers on how many people say they are affiliated and involved with any of these denominations, calculates those over a number of different years, and shows growth rates or declining rates. In many parts of the world, where in the World Value Survey, people said religion is not important to them, these numbers are flat. So there's no growth, there's no decline, simply because people are not switching, people are not looking for new religious opportunities. What is quite striking is that in the whole world, if you look at the 10 fastest growing denominations, 8 of them are either founded by someone in sub-Saharan Africa or based in sub-Saharan Africa. And I find that distinction interesting as well, because I think it's 4 in the top 10 are actually denominations in Europe, but they are denominations in Europe, Christian denominations in Europe, founded by African missionaries. And so I found a statistic that said that in 2015 was the first year where the net flow of missionaries changed to positive, depending on which way you set it up. But the net flow of missionaries, there are more missionaries went from Africa to Europe than from Europe to Africa in 2015. I found that statistic in a Christian magazine. I've never been able to back it up, but I think suggestively, it tells us something about the flow of missioning and the flow of where is religious dynamism in the world now. So this is just in terms of thinking about the market for religion to justify that's important. And then finally, a final piece of evidence that I wanted to share with you in terms of thinking about how do people's economic lives look is just thinking about the amount of money that's spent on religious activity. Here I'm zooming in on a particular example from a Pentecostal church in Ghana. And if I get to one of my papers at the end, I'll tell you a bit more about why Pentecostal churches and what this example might show. But what I wanted to highlight in this example is just the large amounts of money that go to churches. So what we have on the left is an image that made the rounds of Ghanaian Twitter and beyond. So I'll explain what this image is. This is an image from an overhead projection in a big service from one of the biggest churches in Ghana. So it's, I think, a very common, popular church in the country. And they had the service in 2017, where the leaders of the church were saying, if you want a miracle in your life, this is how much money you should give to the church. And so they basically set up the schedule of miracles. So we go from a millionaire status offering all the way down to the 24-hour miracle. We were talking about whether the services churches offer are verifiable or not. Here we have a 24-hour miracle, a seed of perfection, and it ranges from 300 Ghana cedis up to 21,500 Ghana cedis. And of course, make it convenient with the bank account number and mobile money details that you can pay on. So this is what we see on the left. And I just want to compare those figures with figures from the 2017 survey of the 2017 Ghana Statistical Survey. So this is a household survey looking at things like, how much do households spend? What are the demographics of households? And so we can compare the average annual expenditure of a household in Ghana on things like food, housing, and all other costs to what the church is asking for. And it's significant what the church is asking for. In some of the work we've done, we've tried to triangulate what the churches tell us they're getting, what people tell us they're giving the church. And it's pretty credible that the church is getting numbers that look like this, and also getting it in hard currency, by the way. So this is another example of the extent to which people are spending a lot of money on their religious participation. And so usually I'd look at things like this, and as a development economist, where we think about all the other money people could be spending money on, things like, just saving for a rainy day, investing in children's education, starting a new business. If we see numbers like this, the big question that we ask ourselves is, so what are people paying for? What are people getting out of this? And so this is going to take me into the second part of the second point that I made, is one of the things people may be paying for is a change in the choice environment. So I'm going to start talking now about some of the ways that religious beliefs and practices may actually help people in the types of social signaling and economic beliefs that they may need in order to survive in the economic environment. So just thinking about what I mean by the choice environment, I started thinking of choices as the product of beliefs, preferences, and constraints. So beliefs would be, how likely do I think something is going to happen? Preferences would be, do I want to spend a bit more money on food versus clothing? And constraints would be, how much money do I have to spend on either one of these things? Within the literature and economics of religion, we often focus on two sets of beliefs and preferences that might be changed by religious participation. So the first one are social preferences, which a way I'd summarize that is, how do I value other people's outcomes? So do I want to be altruistic towards other people? Do I trust other people? Those are some of the things that I would put under social preferences. A second set of beliefs, or in this case, beliefs rather than preferences, that the economics of religion literature focuses on is what behavioral economists call internal beliefs. So the set of beliefs of people thinking, what is possible for me? And so I'll talk separately about social preferences and internal beliefs now. So starting with social preferences, and as I said, wanting to give you a bit of an overview of what is going on in the economics of religion literature. A paper that I like and that I think sets a lot of the standard for thinking about how religion might be affecting social preferences is this paper by Levy and Razin. And it's a theoretical paper where what they're doing is trying to model this one specific aspect of religious participation and see how it changes behavior. So they focus on the fact that many religions emphasize that if people violate cooperation, they will be punished. So they focus on the fact that as you participate in particular religion, one thing that's going on is increasing the connection that you have between an antisocial behavior and the probability of punishment. What they suggest is this is one way of ensuring that people behave in a more pro-social manner. Because if you believe that you're going to be punished not by other individuals, but rather by some sort of supernatural being, you're more likely to behave in a pro-social or cooperative manner. And so what is interesting about the model, and sort of it comes out from the assumptions, but one implication is that your own behavior might change, as I just said. If you believe there's punishment, you're more likely to cooperate. But also what's interesting as an implication of your model is that expectations about other people's behavior might also change. And so what we'd look for in the data is not only looking to see whether religious people are more trustworthy or more pro-social, but also whether people respond differently when they know that they're interacting with a religious person. So the set of theories and models that might be captured by this sort of thinking might explain why having shared religious beliefs might increase trust, might increase cooperation, in particular across non-family groups. So I'll share a couple of papers that try to explicitly test this model and try to explicitly see, well, what happens when we make religion salient? Does that make people more pro-social? very common way that economists think about prosociality or think about testing prosociality is with lab experiments. So experiments where you give people a chance to do something trusting or to do something altruistic. So when I put up lab experiments here, it's mostly what is called the trust game, where the basic idea of the trust game is if you and I are two players in the trust game, I have the option of giving you some money. If I give you the money, you have the choice of either just keeping it and running away or sending some of that back to me, some sort of multiplier. So that's why it's a game that measures trust. I think we do so many of them as economists because it gives us tractable numbers to play around with. And that's the sort of game that is used in a lot of these settings. So one paper in Burkina Faso finds that priming traditional religious beliefs makes people behave in a more trustworthy way in lab experiments. So they compare people who play the sort of game that I just described, where they just talk about, I think they talk about, it's done in the context of credit groups. So I think they just talk about things related to their business and to their finance loans. And then they play the trust game. And in the second treatment, people talk about their credit and their business, but then they also talk about the set of traditional beliefs that are prevalent in Burkina Faso. In the group that talks about their religious beliefs, so these religious beliefs are salient, people are both more trusting and more trustworthy. So the first mover sends more money, expecting that the other person would send more back, and the other person sends more money back. So that's one piece of evidence supporting this idea that religious beliefs might make people more pro-social. In a more recent paper in DRC, Stoop and Verpoten show how traditional beliefs may actually enhance welfare amongst minors because they enforce a sharing norm. So similar to this idea of the trust game, here in the DR Congo setting, they are not actually playing lab experiments, but they're looking at aggregate data on how much do artisanal miners share with each other and how much do they keep private. And so the argument here is that one thing that traditional beliefs do in that setting is enforce a sharing norm because people believe they'll be punished if they don't share their mining earnings, but also discourage visible wealth accumulation because people believe that others might punish them. So other people who engage in traditional beliefs might punish them if they see there's been too much accumulation. And so they argue that for the group of people working in artisanal mines, these sets of religious beliefs actually enhance welfare overall because they share more and they reduce visible inequality. However, even more recent paper, again using the lab experiment paradigm in DRC, finds that participants in lab experiments actually less pro-social to people who have traditional beliefs. So this paper sets up their results as a surprise and a puzzle that's yet to be explained because it goes against the existing evidence and goes against the main theories people have about how religious signaling might matter. And so as I think I mentioned at the beginning, or if I didn't, I certainly mention now, sort of the big takeaway of all of this is more to be done. So here are a couple of empirical pieces of evidence that might help us understand some of the theoretical predictions, but I think there's still more to understand, why would we think traditional beliefs would be different from Christianity or Islam? What exactly does cooperation look like in different religions? Yeah, those questions like that certainly matter. Okay, so we'll leave social preferences for now and think about internal constraints. So as I said a few slides ago, internal constraints are sort of the set of things that people believe are possible for themselves. And so here I'd focus on a series of models coming out in the past couple of years, thinking about things like hope or aspirations or goal setting. And so one particular paper that I quite like is a paper by Leibert et al., where they model hope as something that changes the set of outcomes people believe are possible for themselves or change the returns people have on effort. So an example to make that concrete would be sitting in a church in Ghana. The pastor always says, I believe God has told me that this year you are going to buy a car. That's the sort of thing that we might think fits into this model of changing the outcomes that people believe are possible for them. So someone who didn't have a car in their aspiration set might now have a car in their aspiration set. But the pastors also say, if you are struggling, if your business is not going well, don't worry because God will provide. So keep up the fight. And so that's the sort of messaging that we might think as changing the return on effort that people put in. And so the implication is that hope increases investment and effort. And so here I just wanted to share a paper that I find very interesting, which is also a working paper. And Putinda and Al, they look at what happens amongst beer sellers in Kinshasa who hold traditional beliefs, but worry that people might steal from them. So what they do in this field experiment is they randomly pay for some of these beer sellers to have access to what they say are renowned traditional healers in the setting who perform spells of protection for the businesses. And then they come back 6 months later and 1 year later. And what they find is when these business owners have a spell performed for them, they actually increase the inventory they keep on stock. And they also report less stress. And they actually collect biomarkers of stress as well. So I find this as a quite interesting paper because it suggests that people who suffered a lot from having a stock out because they didn't keep enough stock on hand because they worried that it would be stolen, this very real economic constraint is alleviated by having these spells cast. Okay, and so that's one example. And then a second example is thinking some of the work that I'm doing in Ghana, where we find that religious people are broadly more resilient to economic shocks. But what is particularly interesting is that religious people in Ghana are more resilient to mental health declines after a shock. So after a particularly bad harvest, after losing a family member, after being hospitalized themselves, and particularly more resilient in terms of cognitive health. And so this resilience in mental and cognitive health seems to then feed into actually staying active in the labor force and continuing to make optimal investments. Okay, and just to keep on time, I'm going to go a bit more quickly through this final point, which is we've seen, first, as I said, religion is important, and I spent a bit of time showing you various ways where we might justify that, and then saw some of the ways religion might change people's social preferences. So it's useful in terms of signaling, but also useful in terms of the beliefs that people have for themselves. And one of the ways that we might think this comes together is in terms of the institutions that people engage in. And so here I'm going to share 3 results that I think are interesting in terms of thinking, what does religion do differently to secular institutions? So first, there's this paper from Murphy and co-authors in Kenya, where they find that churches act as substitutes for agricultural extension networks. So the agricultural extension networks are government-sponsored experts on local agriculture who would usually go around in the rural sectors, giving people information on things like improved seeds or fertilizer appropriate for their particular crops. And what this paper finds is that messages are transmitted more widely within the network and more reliably. So in the sense that people actually remember what they heard when they're transmitted through links in the same church, as opposed to transmitted through the agricultural extension network. Different paper in Benin, but so different paper in different setting, in different country, but looking at malaria bed-nets, but a similar mechanism, where the mechanism is comparing the effectiveness of messaging coming from health workers compared to messaging coming through traditional networks. And in Benin, again, they find that the traditional religious networks seem more effective at transmitting information. And then finally, in a paper that I worked on with co-authors, we find that Pentecostal churches may act as a source of material insurance. So I think I will run out of time, so I won't go into too much detail of the paper, so I'll tell you about what we find here. So what we find in the first Oriol et al. Paper is that when people are randomly assigned to get formal insurance, they give less money to their churches. And so one of the ways that we interpret this is that people are thinking of their church as a source of insurance, because basically they reduce the investment in the church once they have access to formal insurance, and this is randomized, so we can make that conclusion. But what is particularly interesting is that people don't only reduce the amount of money they give to their own church, they reduce the amount of money they give to other things that are broadly called spiritual goods in that setting. So like a national prayer event or charity to an unrelated nonprofit organization, in what we call a manner that's consistent with signaling to God. So in the sense, they are not only signaling to their own church or their own church members, but they are also more broadly reducing spiritual consumption once they get access to insurance. So that's one example of substituting from a religious institution to a secular institution. In related work, we are now writing up the paper where we just demonstrate how many of these secular services that Pentecostal churches provide. So as I mentioned, things like people getting matched, businesses getting matched with employees. A really important role that people tell us the church plays for them is finding marriage partners. People find daycare and so on. And so these are all things that could theoretically be purchased outside of the church, but the church seems more and more important as a source of these secular services. And the interesting questions here are sort of thinking about what is specific to religion compared to other social institutions. I put in the title, it might be things like the trust, it might be the coordination, the shared beliefs about punishment, but we definitely need to do more work to understand those. Also interesting is thinking about what competition might look like between different religious institutions. As I mentioned at the beginning, one of the things that's particularly striking in sub-Saharan Africa is how much dynamism there is between different denominations. So it's interesting to think about what the competition looks like. Okay, so I will not go into detail on my own papers because I talked very much in the broad overview and my phone is shouting at me, but I'll conclude on some of the things that I've shared now. So if I think about where we'd want to position some of the work on the economics of religion, when I think about how economists are increasingly thinking about how non-standard beliefs and preferences shape economic outcomes. So things like aspirations, things like anxiety, things like fear or other types of social preferences, they matter, of course. And I think we're trying to understand more and more how they matter. And there's already quite a lot of work on existing informal institutions. And so we sort of think about religion as lying at the intersection of these two areas of inquiry. What I'd say is it's important to try to incorporate religious beliefs and practices more fully into understanding the economic lives in Africa. And I've tried to give a couple of reasons. So one is just seeing how important it is. I chose 4 of the statistics or figures that I thought would make the point quickly, although I wasn't very quick, but there are many more. So I was sort of just working on a piece, writing up. If we look at the data, people are spending a lot of time, money, and effort on religious practice. So it's important to understand what's going on. Part of what might be going on is the fact that religion does change things like social preferences in a way that might be different to how other institutions, other technologies work in terms of signaling something about behavior to others. Also quite interesting is thinking about internal constraints. That's something that is certainly very different. The fact that you might have non-verifiable beliefs, both about yourself and about other beings who might act on you, that might be important in things like investment and things where there's uncertainty to deal with. And then finally, I shared a couple of quick examples of how religious institutions might be providing important substitutes to secular institutions. the main takeaway, said a couple of times, there's much more to be done. But hopefully what I've shared with you are a couple of interesting insights and results coming from the economics of religion literature. And I very much look forward to having a discussion with you about what was striking, what is missing, what are some of the things that you'd all take away after 35 minutes of me talking. So thank you.